Good evening, friends, and welcome to Mirror Valley. It is a common sentiment that blood is thicker than water, that family ties run deep. However, sometimes familial relationships can become toxic, and one is better off leaving their own bloodline behind, no matter how deep the roots of the family tree might grow. Tonight, we find out what happens when one man's familial bonds are too strong to be severed altogether. The time is at hand once more. Turn off the lights, lock your doors, and join me as we take a look at another twisted reflection. Family ties. My grandfather, Chester Crowley, has always been the source of rumors and whispered talk in our family. He was, to put it plainly, the black sheep of our particular bloodline. My mother was estranged from him since before I was born. They never spoke to each other, and she never spoke of him. But sometimes, when we spent holidays with the extended family, I would hear him mentioned in hushed tones, gossiped about quietly when they thought no one else was listening. I was never told anything about Grandpa Crowley directly, but over the years, with each little nugget of information I was able to gather, a picture began to form. It was not a pleasant one. The stories I overheard painted a portrait of an obscenely wealthy but extraordinarily stingy man, stern and commandeering, a distant father, a cold and unloving husband. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. There were other stories about him, stories that hinted at something darker and more sinister than anything I could have imagined. There were rumors that he was involved heavily in the occult, that perhaps he'd even made his fortune by entering into a bargain with the devil himself. It wasn't until my early 20s that I finally saw a photo of him, the only one I'd ever seen. I'd happened upon my cousin and her husband in the guest bedroom, whispering over a photograph. When they left the room, I snuck in and took a look. What I saw sent me reeling. It was my grandfather, Grandfather Crowley, outfitted in strange clothes and presiding over what looked like some sort of satanic altar. Apparently all the stories I'd heard about him were true. I met him only once, at my mother's funeral. I recognized him right away. His large, domineering frame demanded attention. He observed the service quietly and respectfully, despite the sideways glances and whispers from the rest of the family. As I stood in front of the room to deliver my eulogy, he locked his eyes on me, and not once did he look away. When the funeral was over, he headed directly to me, smiling down at me with what was clearly an attempt at warmth, but something about his demeanor, about the blackness behind his eyes, sent a cold chill down my spine. He offered me his condolences and told me that though my mother wouldn't let him near, he'd been following my development from afar. Something animal deep inside me shrieked out in alarm, and I wanted nothing more than to be away from this man as quickly as humanly possible. He excused himself shortly after. "Make sure you take good care of yourself," he told me as he left. "It's very important. And if I can ever make your life easier, here's my number." He passed me a note with his personal phone number scrawled on it and left me alone. As much as his offer tempted me, especially in difficult times, I never called. Something about the impression he'd left on me kept me from dialing the number. I put him out of my mind, and in time, all but forgot about him, until the phone call I received yesterday. It was from Grandpa Crowley's personal attendant. He informed me that my grandfather was very ill, bedridden, and unlikely to survive the week. His only deathbed request was for my presence at his side. I agreed to travel to his estate the next day, as much out of morbid curiosity as any hopes I had about being included in his will. I was led into the room where my grandfather lay, dying, a shell of the man he once was. He could barely speak, but managed to whisper to me, "I'm so glad you've come. Please, take my hand." I joined him at his bedside and gingerly held his frail hand in mine. The old man smiled, locking eyes with me. Despite his physical frailty, his eyes still possessed the same intense power as before. He gripped my hand tightly with surprising strength and whispered something under his breath, something that sounded like a foreign language. I opened my mouth to tell him I couldn't understand, but almost instantly, the room started swimming around me. Then everything went black.
We will return to our story in just a moment. But first...
Enjoying the show? Please help us out and like this video, and subscribe to the Mirror Valley YouTube channel. Click the bell to be notified of new videos almost every week. And be sure to visit our website, mirrorvalley.com, for new episodes, the latest news, and behind-the-scenes information. That's mirrorvalley.com.
And now, the conclusion of tonight's story.
He gripped my hand tightly with surprising strength and whispered something under his breath, something that sounded like a foreign language. I opened my mouth to tell him I couldn't understand, but almost instantly, the room started swimming around me. Then everything went black. I awoke moments later, my head pounding. As my eyes regained their focus, I realized I was lying in bed, the same bed that my grandfather had been lying in before. I moved to sit up, but found I could barely move. My whole body was weaker than it had ever been. I called out for help, but even my voice was little more than a whisper. And then I saw him, standing over my bed, watching me, a self-satisfied smile on his face. It was me, or at least it was my body, but the dark forces swirling behind the eyes of my grandfather were still unmistakable, even though the eyes were no longer that of an old man's. They were mine. I looked down and saw my grandfather's emaciated, wrinkled body. I tried desperately to sit up, to scream, "Somebody help me! This isn't my body!" But I lacked the strength. I could only lie there and groan. I watched as my body spoke to the assistant. "I think he's in pain. You might want to give him something." He turned to leave, but first he looked down at himself, putting his hands, my hands, on his arms, his torso. He looked up with a smile, satisfied with his discovery. "Don't worry," he said. "It will all be over soon. And thank you for taking such good care of yourself."
And so our time together comes to an end once more. Our paths will cross again soon. Until then, keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and remember, what you see in the mirror is not always what it appears to be. Until next time, good night, friends.